Welcome to City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Steph Routh, a member of City Club's Forum Board. For more than a century, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people have come together to find solutions to our region's biggest challenges. We're gathered today at the Sentinel Hotel and are joined by thousands of people via X-Ray.fm and its radio stations at 107.1 and 91.1 FM, KGW's website, Facebook feed, and news app, and Open Signal's community media television stations. We are incredibly grateful for all the work they do, bringing Friday Forum to our community. In addition to City Club's valued media partners, our sponsors, volunteers, and staff enable us to put on Oregon's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to thank AARP Oregon and Avangrid Renewables for their generous support to this and all our Friday Forums this fall. I'd also like to thank Kaiser Permanente for its special support for today's program. Please join me in showing our appreciation to everyone who has made this event possible. Now, I'd like to welcome Carol Collymore, our moderator for today's debate. Carol is the Senior Manager of Community Impact at Nike, hence her shoes. She also serves as Secretary of the Cascades AIDS Project Board of Directors and is the former Executive Director of the Equity Foundation. Carol is a frequent Friday Forum moderator, and we're so pleased to have her here for today's debate. Please join me in welcoming Carol Collymore.
All right. Thank you, Steph, and welcome to the panelists and voters with us today. On stage with me today are both sides of Measure 26-199, Metro's bond measure to fund affordable housing. They're here to answer questions that Metro has put before the voters. Should Metro issue $652.8 million in bonds to fund affordable housing for low-income families, seniors, veterans, and people with disabilities in Washington, Clackamas, and Multnomah counties? On the yes side, we have Lynn Peterson, President-elect of Metro, which covers Multnomah, Washington, and Clackamas counties. She has served in Washington State in Governor Inslee's administration and here in Oregon with Governor Kitzhaber. She has also served as chair of the Clackamas County Commission and on the Lake Oswego City Council. And Shannon Singleton, Executive Director of Join, which supports individuals and families as they transition from homelessness to permanent housing. Ms. Singleton has served in many roles working with and advocating for people who are houseless. She has served on the Welcome Home Coalition Steering Committee, Portland Housing Advisory Commission, and helped pass the Yes for Affordable Homes, ballot measure in 2016. On the no side, we welcome Andy Dyke, Washington County Chair and member of the Washington County Commission for the last 24 years. In his position, he serves as the chair of Washington County Housing Board. In 1983, he founded Dyke Machine, a manufacturing business that produces metal and plastic components. And also on the no side is Dr. Jerry Milner, an associate professor of real estate finance and the founder of the Master of Real Estate Development program at Portland State University. To open our debate, each side will have 90 seconds for a statement. Once the opening statements have concluded, we'll move on to questions. Each side will have 60 seconds to answer each question. When I've completed my prepared questions, each side will have an opportunity to give a 90-second closing statement. Mark Stefan from the City Club Research Committee that investigated this ballot measure will present the committee's findings after that. Once the committee presentation is complete, I will ask audience questions via note card. Each side will get 45 seconds to answer each audience question. To our audience members, please refrain from clapping or cheering during the debate. It's important for our broadcast audience to hear from both sides without distractions or interruptions. Our panelists and the audience should know that if one side goes past its allotted time, their microphone will be turned off and the discussion will move on. All right, that's my favorite part. All right, so to begin, we'll hear from the yes side. You'll have 60 seconds. 60, 60. 90. I'm sorry, 90 seconds. It's close.
Well, thank you, Carol, and thank you to City Club for hosting this debate. We are in an affordable housing crisis. Today, you can work full-time, pull down an average salary of $31,200, and still not afford a one-bedroom apartment in Portland. The issue is not just economic, it's moral. We need to make sure that hardworking people can do right by their families. Metro's regional bond measure is the right measure. This is about putting dollars into local communities to solve a region-wide issue. It's big enough to make a dent, but small enough to remain affordable to taxpayers across the region. While we estimate 12,000 people to be served when the units open in the next 5 years, this investment will serve thousands of families over the life of the building and the units. As the ballot language actually states, permanently affordable housing. This is not the only solution to our problem, but it is the one we are voting on this fall. To meet a crisis that's measured not in time, but in lives. Doing nothing is not an option. Doing something means voting yes on Measure 26199 and Measure 102, state constitutional change. And doing something this innovative is what the citizens of this region are known for accomplishing together. Thank you.
No side.
So I should preface my remarks by saying I'm not speaking for the university, the Center for Real Estate, the business school. I'm speaking for myself. I mean, I think if you want to look at this measure, you have to look at it in either one of two prisms, either as social policy or as housing policy. I think it fails on both scores. As far as social policy goes, we would like to help the poor, and the best way, the most efficient way to do that is to give them cash. That's how we help the elderly, for example. You get a monthly Social Security check. Now, the second best solution would be to give them a voucher. That's why federal housing policy changed in the 1970s away from projects to vouchers. It's more efficient, probably about a third more efficient. But to give them a specific unit really locks them into place and removes from the tenant kind of the choice that they would have. And then finally, as a fourth best solution, giving it only to a very small fraction of the population who are eligible is very inefficient. This purports to develop 3,900 units with a 30-year bond, so that's about 300 units per year. That's a pretty small number in a region that produces about 12 to 14,000 units per year. So I think as housing policy, it probably won't produce much housing at all. Most of the sites that are going to be chosen for these projects would be sites that would otherwise be developed by the private sector.
Okay. So first question is for both sides. Metro's portfolio is wide and expansive. It includes protecting farms and forests from urbanization via the urban growth boundary, running the zoo, the expo center, the convention center, Portland 5, running the region's solid waste and recycling centers, managing 17,000 acres of parks and trails and nature areas. You get the point. As a region-wide planning organization, some believe Metro is the perfect entity to take on the regional housing crisis. Others see this as mission creep and an overreach. Why Metro and why now? And we'll start with the yes side.
I think that's a really good question to ask because we have asked Metro to do two things. One, plan for our future, and then implement. And when you have an issue that there are no boundaries within the entire region, we need to ask the question, how do we raise all boats? And that's what Metro did, is they stepped forward and asked the jurisdictions, how do we raise all boats when we are in the middle of a crisis? I think there's two aspects to this ballot measure that are very important to remember. In no way, shape, or form did Metro put this on the ballot with the expectation that they ever become a housing authority. They have left that very specific task to those who know how to do this. So they're essentially the entity that is able to put it out to the ballot, bring in the money, and distribute it to the county housing authorities who know how to do this with nonprofits and private developers.
There is no expectation that Metro will become a housing authority, except that there's nothing in this bond measure that prevents that from happening. This is definitely mission creep, and the argument that it's more efficient or effective doing it at the Metro level is just simply not true. This is all based on, the amount of revenue that it would bring in is based on assessed value, and the assessed value remains the same across the region or in 3 individual counties. What this does, though, is it allows Metro to get their nose under the tent, so to speak, and start to be the conduit for the funds which they then can control, and control how local governments grow their own communities. So this is definitely a mission creep, and it's certainly not the most efficient way to raise the funds nor to spend them.
Okay, this question is again for both, and we'll start with the no side. How did we get here? As a region, how did our housing situation get so dire that we're now putting forth an over $600 million housing bond that many believe is too small to even make a dent in the housing crisis?
So I put a lot of blame on the way that we manage land use regulations. I've been a critic of Metro in the way that they've managed the urban growth boundary for a number of years. Since 1980, our population as a region has grown by 79%, but our urban growth boundary has only grown by 10%. What that's forcing the development community to do is to look at the rattier parcels, the parcels that were left over from the last development cycle, and it was, you know, the UGB was put in place on this mantra of we should grow up rather than growing out. That's a nice slogan. You know, I don't particularly want to grow out, and we all want to be more mature. We all want to grow up, but I think what we need to recognize is it's more costly. Building multi-story apartments simply costs substantially more, almost double, than it is to build single-family homes, and that's been our problem.
So I would disagree and say that, and remind folks that how we got here is really a national problem. It was mentioned earlier about switching to a voucher system in the 70s, but we also had a huge decline in federal investment in affordable housing. At the same time that happened is when we started to see homelessness as it exists today. And in order for us to do something about that, we have to actually develop the housing that people can afford. The voucher system is not as effective, and we have right now 71% of adults who are sleeping in a shelter are making SSI income. And so there is just the reality of income, whether it's federally or working people, that does not match current rents.
Okay. Another question for both of you, and we'll start with the yes side. The bond costs are estimated at 24 cents per 1,000 of assessed value annually, which pencils out to approximately $60 a year for the average homeowner. Is this a good investment for regional taxpayers or a bad deal?
It's an economic investment for our future, and that's why it was so important to size this measure appropriately, not only to make a dent as we move forward, which, again, it does make a substantial dent in the next 5 years, not 30. I think that's very important. When you pay off a bond, that's the time to pay off the bond, not the time that we'll be building those units. So it's 5 years that we'll be building 3,900 units. So it does make a significant dent. And what that means is that for folks out in Hillsborough who are HR managers who are not able to attract highly skilled mechanics at $25 an hour, and if they do come to work for them, they're camping out because they can't find any affordable housing, it means that we are economically disadvantaged right now in this region. So in order to be able to keep our businesses growing, in order to do the right thing, we all need to chip in, and that's why $5 a month, we're hoping folks are willing to make that kind of investment in each other. Thanks.
When we're talking about whether or not this is an economical investment or not, we need to consider all ranges of income. And part of our contention on the opposition side has been that we have a substantial number of people out there who are having trouble affording their homes. Any increase in taxes is a burden on those folks. So while we could make the argument that yes, we're helping about 10% of the folks who fall within the 80% and lower median income bracket, we're hurting about 90% of those folks. And that's the part, the message we're trying to drive home, is that we need to have some compassion for those 90% who can't afford these steadily increasing taxes.
So just a quick follow-up question to that. It's a property tax, so what happens to the rest of us? So I rent, so how do we assess it can we assess it more fairly so that everyone who can't afford it can kind of help support the bond if it passed? Is that? Either side, please take it.
Well, I mean, a renter will only pay that expense indirectly insofar as the rental market will bear those costs. So, and the other thing I would keep in mind from a homeowner's point of view is these are 30-year bonds. So if it's $60 a year that you're paying, you're really talking about $1,800 over the lifetime of the bonds. What I've been concerned that the Metro should be investing in other things like infrastructure, for example, and that this bond measure will wear out the voters' welcome to these kind of investments.
Yes, side.
So I would argue that housing is infrastructure and that this bond is a really important component of us building healthy communities. Additionally, the rents are increasing every year now. I too am a renter and was sharing with somebody on my way over. I'm fortunate to have somebody who owns the house who is actually not increasing my rent, and that is the first time that has ever happened in my entire life. The idea that rents aren't going to increase, they have continued to in the region over time, and they are expected to increase again in the coming years. So that idea of the cost being passed on to renters is already happening, but it's not actually going to build affordable housing. It's just going into the pocket of the landlord.
So again, this question is for both. The word moral is freely used when talking about housing. And the impact of our current housing and homelessness crisis in Oregon is obviously felt most strongly by our poorest and most diverse and most vulnerable neighbors. What's our moral imperative when it comes to these groups, and will this housing bond actually target these folks with the supports they need? And you start with no side.
Okay, so the word moral has been thrown around. I've heard it said that we have a moral obligation to provide housing for people. I would say we have a moral obligation to first do no harm, and that's the premise again. Instead of looking at the people that will be helped, and there will be people helped, and for those people it does make a difference. But what about for those people who will be harmed? We're ignoring them so that we can assuage our feelings of our desire to help the 10%. And again, that's the crux of the whole argument. Let's do no harm first.
I would argue that housing is a human right and that there is a moral obligation for us to provide opportunity for people to live inside. We know that this isn't the only solution. It is one piece of the solution. It is one mechanism. There will be an additional need for more funding and revenue for both affordable housing development and services throughout all of our communities. And I think as we continue to do this, we have to look at other revenue streams as well and continue to address the issue in every part of our region.
And so a quick follow-up for the no side. I hear you saying 90% and protect 90% as opposed to 10%, if I'm understanding you correctly. But shouldn't we at least take a shot at it? I mean, they're humans, 10% human people. And so if this isn't the best shot, what is?
Well, rents are determined, by supply and demand in the marketplace. And, right now we're building about 10% fewer housing units as a region as we did 1990 to 2007, even though, home prices and rents have fully recovered from the Great Recession. So you would think that those high prices and those rents would encourage people to be developing more. The problem is that the single-family market has basically been cut off. We're not building, new subdivisions in the way that we used to in the 1990s and the early part of the 2000s, I should say. We also have a problem that the market that has been strong the last 10 years is really under threat. The apartment market in the central part of Portland, has been our mainstay. That number of units we're building in apartments have been about the same, but the city's inclusionary zoning policy has really stopped any new applications from coming forward. So I think we've got a real problem in the housing market if we look longer term. And I think we should be focusing on all renters, not just the 10% that get these lucky units.
Please.
I think if we flip this, there was a red herring brought up here about the urban growth boundary, and if we just expand the urban growth boundary, suddenly we'll be able to have more affordable housing. And if you flip it, the 90% have actually been getting that windfall every single time we open up the urban growth boundary. On the flip side, we have not done anything for the 10% that have been waiting for the last 20 to 30 years, waiting on lists of 5,000 people when I was chair of Clackamas County, for 5, 8, 10 years they were waiting. Most of them seniors, widows, that were just waiting to get in so that they could have a stable place to live and be able to take care of their medical issues, take care of their family issues. So I think that, when we talk about this benefiting a small 10%, we have overlooked that 10% for far too long.
For our radio audience, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Carol Collymore, the moderator of today's debate on Measure 26-199, a Metro bond measure that would be used to develop affordable housing. Joining us are Lynn Peterson, President-elect of the Metro Council, and Shannon Singleton, the Executive Director of JOIN, both of whom support Metro's bond measure. Opposing the measure are Andy Dyke, the Washington County Chair, and Dr. Jerry Mildner, an Associate Professor of Real Estate Finance at Portland State University. Okay, so one more question for both of you. Can Metro hold county and municipal housing authorities accountable for achieving stated affordable housing targets? We can start with no.
I believe Metro can, particularly if Metro is the conduit for the funding. But even with the current situation, Metro works very closely with us to hit targets within different communities, and it's very successful. We just opened the Willow Creek Apartments, we did the groundbreaking for Willow Creek Apartments, 120-unit apartment complex, and that was a collaborative between Metro and Washington County and the state, and it works very well. That model works very well, and it doesn't put additional burden on any other taxpayer. So yes, I think they can and do hold local governments accountable.
Yes.
A refreshing moment of agreement.
Yeah, we will. I think it's an imperative, but I think that is also collaborative, right? I mean, this is the risk management side of the equation that we're going to need to continually work on as a state, as a region, and make sure that we're ahead of the issues. But one of the things that's already come up during the City of Portland's work on their bond measure is that there was a constitutional amendment that was required. And so what did we do? We put it to the ballot to get rid of that barrier. So it's acknowledging that we have an issue, going out and then getting that taken care of so we can get rid of any barriers that don't make us as cost effective. And that Measure 102 constitutional amendment will allow us to have private-public development and not own the actual housing units as Metro or as the government. So it will help us do what the counties have already been doing as when they receive their HUD money, which is what they would like to be able to do. So it's being able to be that kind of flexibility and proactiveness that we need in order to keep moving.
Great. To the no side, Metro has signaled to expanding the urban growth boundary to accommodate some affordable housing units. For either of you on the no side, does that impact your opposition to the proposal?
Well, I think it's long overdue. I mean, we're talking about 4 cities, probably 9,000 housing units will come out of those 4 expansions. As a region, we're probably 50,000 housing units short coming out of the Great Recession. Again, as I cite my earlier number that we're producing about 10% less than we did 1990 to 2007. So we've got kind of a chronic problem as well as an ongoing problem. So these 9,000 units are welcome, but frankly, I think Metro is going to have to look at expansions on a very regular basis in order to put our housing market back in gear. The problem we're facing is we have thousands of people moving to our region every year from California, and if you don't let them buy single-family homes on the suburban fringe, which is what they're looking for, they're going to compete for the low-income housing neighborhoods that we have in our city, places like Aloha, places like the East Side. So you can either choose gentrification or you can allow for the housing market to expand.
I think gentrification's already happened, though. I don't know that anybody's choosing it.
Could you repeat that?
I think gentrification's already happening. I don't know that anybody's choosing it, just to be fair.
Well, I certainly agree.
Okay. To the yes side, if the bond should pass, How could Metro ensure that communities of color who have historically experienced the negative impacts of gentrification and discriminatory housing policies experience more equitable outcomes where the benefits and burdens of affordable housing are fairly distributed across the community?
So I think that Metro has already shown some really intensive engagement with community. The bond process had a lot of community engagement and specifically focused around racial equity. That work continues as you start to think about implementation. And I do think we also have lessons learned from the Portland bond that are good practices to bring in, and some of what we've done with where the neighborhoods are located, who has access, that we can pull into the Metro bond process. And I also believe that communities of color are out here in support of finding housing for us. We are some of the lowest income folks in the community because of racism, and we would like to be able to, at the very least, get our families into housing.
Just to fill out the time a little bit, with a specific request that was part of that was to actually purchase existing affordable housing in existing communities. So that is part of the bond measure.
A question for both of you, and Chair-elect Peterson, you mentioned this. What lessons have been learned from the City of Portland Housing Bond, and have those lessons been incorporated into the Metro bond request? We can start with no.
Excuse me, the Portland bond, I think the biggest lesson that needed to be learned was that the dollars don't go near as far when you can't marry them up with private sector dollars or nonprofit dollars. And I think the entire region recognizes that, and that's why I'm in support of Measure 102 to change the statewide constitution as well. That's the biggest part of it. The other part, very quickly, is that I think Portland has learned the lesson that when you purchase low-income residences or complexes within the downtown area, it affects other things like the density that you think you're going to get in your city, because you've essentially taken that facility off the market for the private sector, and you're not going to get the infill the way you intended for it to be.
I believe that some of the lessons learned are, again, that community engagement piece that I do see Metro already doing. The other parts are really about how to do partnership between the developer, the property manager, and nonprofits who are working to get folks back into housing. There's some really interesting work happening to make sure that the people who are the most vulnerable in our community are able to access these types of units. So those are some of the important lessons, I believe. The other thing is we had to do a bit of a stakeholder process after the fact, after the bond was passed for Portland. And again, Metro has already taken that lesson and did that process before putting it forward on the ballot.
Okay, you just brought up Measure 102, and so we'll just kind of talk about that a little bit. In addition to the Metro bond measure, Oregon ballots this year will hold Measure 102. Currently, the state constitution does not allow revenue from bond issues to be used in a project with private owners or stakeholders. Measure 102 was designed to provide an exception to this prohibition for the Constitution of Affordable Housing. What are your thoughts on the constitutional amendment? And we can start with the yes.
So just to get geeky, because I am mostly a transportation person, this is originally from the original Constitution. When the citizens of Oregon created their first Constitution, they said, we do not want waste, fraud, and abuse when using general obligation bonds with the railroads, because the railroads were coming through and asking for money through general obligation bonds. And so we said, no, we don't want to get involved in that. And so what that's done now is prohibited us from doing private-public developments with private companies that would then own the asset at the end of the day. So this actually allows us to do, again, what HUD already allows the counties to do at the end of the day is private and nonprofit to be able to manage those units, own those units, or some combination of land and housing. So very much for it, so that we can reduce the cost. The average unit without this constitutional amendment would be about $225,000 per unit. With the amendment, it would taken away, it would be $167,000. So we'd be able to get the full 3,900 units.
No, side, do you have a?
Yeah, I can address it. Again, as I stated earlier, I'm in favor of it, and Lynn did a very good job explaining the history of it. But this is the way we do partnerships already. We just don't use bond proceeds for it. We think that it would help the city of Portland. It would help Washington County if we ever chose to do a bond. I have my own reservations about that, but at least if you get to the point where you have bond proceeds, you should be able to work with your partners in the community to make those dollars go further. And the nonprofits oftentimes do a much better job of managing those projects and keeping the maintenance done. And so it's always good to build partnerships wherever you can to get the best bang for the buck.
Okay. So this is a question for both. What do you see as the main risks of if the bond passes or doesn't pass? And we'll start with no.
Start with us. Well, I think this has been a missed opportunity. I mean, as I understand Metro's planning for bond measures, they were going to do housing in 2018, open spaces in 2019, and infrastructure in 2020. And my concern is that is that there's going to be some voter fatigue before it gets to the parts of those three bond measures, which is really Metro's core function. Metro's core function is land use regulation and infrastructure coordination. And it seems like a real shame, given Lynn's expertise as a transportation planner and a transportation engineer, that the outgoing Metro Council didn't kind of clear the decks and give her a pot of money to help solve some of our transportation problems that this region has. And I think it would have had an indirect effect on housing provision. If you look at all of these new UGB expansions that are going to happen, there needs to be some infrastructure help to the communities. So I think it's kind of a lost opportunity. That's the way I would frame it.
So the risk here is doing nothing is not an option. We need to move forward. We need to do this now. It has impacts throughout the rest of our region. We are losing people from this region to other regions, skilled labor. We are forcing folks to go further out to find affordable housing, where Miles Fiberglass out in Clackamas County, in order to attract workers and get them to actually come and do production, are actually paying them gas money because they've had to move so far out. The more we move further out, the more transportation issues are going to be. This is the number one issue to solve some of our transportation issues, is to keep people where there are jobs, where there's education, where there's health services, and where there's shopping. If we don't do that, then we have an even larger problem. We start here, we start now, and it's with housing.
Okay, we have about 2 minutes left. To the yes side, in a hypothetical exercise, the bond passes, we fast forward 10 years. The housing bond has not been successful. What led to it not being successful? What can be done to mitigate that?
I don't believe that that's the future scenario.
I don't believe in no-win scenarios.
I really do believe that it will be successful. Again, we are seeing success with the Portland bond. We are seeing apartments open. We are seeing families move out of shelter or off the streets and into these apartments. We are seeing people actually find stability and a place to call home again. That's why I believe that it will work, and why I have a tough time answering that future question, because I just don't believe that's what it will look like.
Fair enough. To the no side, in a similar hypothetical exercise, this housing bond does not pass. What is your plan for addressing our region's housing and homelessness crisis?
Okay, well, I've been advocating for a three-point plan, and the market is an amazing thing, and it is the only tool that can ultimately deal with this issue long-term. That doesn't mean there isn't a need for public housing. There always will be. And I believe, as one of my points, we should continue our efforts to build public-private partnerships and open new facilities. As I stated, we're doing a 120-unit project. We're also going to be doing about 500 more in the next 2 years. But in addition to that, we need to look at the land supply. We need to look at how the land supply affects the cost and the inputs going into housing. We also need to look at the permits and fees that we as local governments charge, and reassess whether or not we are an obstacle to the construction of affordable housing. So I oftentimes make the point that you can't guarantee that the market will build affordable housing, but you can sure guarantee that it won't build it if the inputs going into it prevent that from happening.
Okay, now it's time for closing statements, and there was, I think, a rock, paper, scissors before lunch started, with the yes side going first.
Thank you. So I just want to remind folks that we're talking a lot about policy up here, but this is impacting people and lives right now. The reason that we need to do this type of bond is to really find apartments that people can live in. People like the 83-year-old woman who was sleeping in her van because she was priced out of her apartment when her husband passed away and she lost that second Social Security income. This is units for the people like the mother who is sleeping outside on the street right now in a tent, wiping down her 3 children with baby wipes to make sure that they're able to get to school and look clean and not be made fun of. She then goes into a day center to get a shower so that she can go to work. I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that this is about human beings, our neighbors, and our community, and that is why we need to move forward and vote yes on this bond.
Wonderful, thank you. Mark, if you want to make your way up to read the report.
One more close.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
I have a head cold. It's terrible.
No, we should end there.
I understand.
No, please, no side closing statement. My apologies.
Okay. We've addressed quite a few groups about this issue and addressed them jointly, both the proponents and opponents. And after thoughtful consideration by most of those groups, they've either voted to oppose it or they've voted to take no position on it. And why is that? Well, partly because the request for $652 million is only part of the cost, and it alone does not make housing affordable. There is nothing affordable about it until local governments kick in even more money through HUD vouchers or through general fund dollars to buy down rents. That's the dirty little secret to this. This information is conveniently left out of this measure, but it's also because this housing tax purports to help those in need, yet it ignores that there are even more people who are in need who are harmed by this measure. But it's up to us to speak out when families are hurt by well-meaning intentions. For every person who's lucky enough to win the lottery of public housing, there are 9 more people who are going to be hurt because they're going to be paying higher rents and higher taxes. So I ask you to be compassionate to them as you would be to the one, and please vote no on the Metro bond measure.
Thank you for real this time, both sides. And please welcome Mark with the committee report.
As you've just heard, this is a complex measure with many factors to consider. This summer, I was one of 6 members of a research committee charged with researching the implications of Metro's bond measure and reporting our findings to City Club members and the general public. Beth Crane, John Engel, Reed Morgan, Dan Melton, Philippe Boutros, and I met weekly for an hour and a half in person, by conference call, and via video conferencing to share what we found individually, discuss the details of the research, and collaborate on the final report. Early in the process, to better understand what Metro is proposing, we conducted a background and technical session with Metro staff. Later, we held a second joint technical and background session with the executive directors of the housing authorities of each of the 3 counties covered by this bond measure. We also conducted a panel interview with 2 opponents identified in the preliminary research and held an additional session with an opponent who was not able to attend the first panel interview. The proponents panel interview included a mix of elected officials, nonprofit developers, and affordable housing advocates. In addition to witness testimony, we gathered, reviewed, and analyzed documents and media reports, and reviewed literature about how other jurisdictions are addressing and financing affordable housing in their communities. After weeks, and I mean weeks, of fact-finding and discussion, the committee unanimously voted to support the Metro bond ballot measure. The committee agrees that there's a shortage of affordable housing in our region and that the bond measure, if passed, will improve the supply of affordable housing for low-income populations. We also agree that this is an appropriate action for Metro. the market has shown itself to be less than capable of addressing the need for low-income housing. This signals a clear role for governmental action, particularly a regional government that can coordinate and align strategies across counties and cities within the metro service area. Yet, no single entity can solve the housing crisis alone, and this bond measure will not fix the affordable housing crisis. But our committee believes that the flexibility of this bond measure provides will allow governments and developers to better meet local and regional needs, and that the financial burden spread across 3 counties will be low compared to the gains in housing for our most vulnerable residents. It is also important to point out that communities of color are disproportionately represented in low-income populations and have historically been negatively impacted by gentrification and discriminatory housing policies. We believe this bond measure, as proposed, would begin to address this historical structural inequity. I'm going to actually add one small side note to my prepared comments. And this is something that comes out of the committee's deliberations. We really see this bond as the beginning of a metropolitan dialogue on affordable housing, the beginning of that conversation. Based just on these conversations, the back and forth that we heard from our presenters just a few minutes ago, there are multiple policy options that arguably should be considered, maybe at the same time. And the problem sometimes, and this is the one that we struggled with as we came to our decision, was that it's not simply a government, in this case Metro through a bond, nor is it simply a market. It is both. And thinking about all the range of options has to actively be a part of this process in the years ahead, or we will not make a dent on affordable housing. So this was a conversation that we had over the span of the time that we were together. And yet, after considering these numerous factors, the committee recommends a yes vote on Metro's affordable housing bond. Last month, City Club membership agreed with our approach to the research and voted 91% to adopt the report. As a final note, I'd like to thank all City Club members for making it possible for our committee to conduct this research and for participating in the voting process. Ballot measure research is vital to the health of our democracy in Oregon, and together we're providing voters with valuable tools to help them cast their votes. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. It's now time for audience questions. We are not taking questions today at the microphone, but if you've written a question on an index card, hold it high for City Club staff to collect. You can also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag #FridayForum. For our radio audience, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Carol Collymore, the moderator for today's debate on Measure 26-199, a Metro bond measure that would be used to develop affordable housing. Joining us are Lynn Peterson, President-elect of the Metro Council, and Shannon Singleton, Executive Director of JOIN, both of whom support Metro's bond measure. Opposing the measure are Andy Dyke, the Washington County Chair, and Dr. Jerry Mildner, an Associate Professor of Real Estate Finance at Portland State University. Do we have audience questions? I see them coming from the back of the room. Slowly but surely. You can run if you want. I'll give you some Nikes. Just kidding. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Thank you. Okay, for the no side, is there a more effective and efficient use of $600 million to make housing more accessible for people?
Well, there is. But first of all, we need to stop and think about what we call tax fatigue. And I think most people in this room know what that means. Many of us, since Measure 5 and 50, have relied, many governments have relied on levies all along to provide basic services. And we have to have those levies approved every 5 years. If we put too much of a tax burden on the public, then we know that there is a point in there, and I can't quantify where that point is, but we know there's a point where people create a tax revolt. And that doesn't help any government, and it'll end up causing us to have to cut back on basic services. So is there a better way to spend the $650 on housing specifically? Sure, if it were at the local level, it'd be a lot more efficient, but we still have that whole issue of who are we taxing and who are we harming by those taxes?
Can I just respond
Absolutely.
to that? First, I want to go back to some misleading comments made in the concluding remarks by the opponents. There are over 400 organizations that have endorsed, individuals who have endorsed, and companies that have endorsed in this campaign. So to say that there is no one supporting this campaign is very misleading. There are only 7 folks, the last time I looked, that have endorsed no. So this is a region-wide issue, and it's acknowledged region-wide. Secondly, to the issue, is there another way? There are a myriad of different things that we need to do in addition to this. And I think that Chair Dyke and I have talked nonstop about all the other things that we need to work on, and I'm so glad that he has started to look at that with Mayor Denny Doyle of SDC's fees and fines, fees that are going forward. And I look forward to working with him on the other side of his retirement on this issue.
For the yes side, you're characterizing this expenditure as a, quote, investment. Please explain the, quote, return on investment. Tell us the math. What is the projected return on investment?
I think what we're talking about here is an investment in the community, if that's the comment that I made that we're responding to. And it really comes down to the economics of this region, that if we are not able to house, because the market is not able to actually take care of those at 0 to 30% of median family income, we need to step in, whether it's the counties using their HUD and state funding, and now the region's funding. It's the return on investment in our community to make sure that those who need to be housed here, to work here, to move our economy along, can be housed here.
I'll respond. I mean, I think, the number I would keep in mind is we have probably about 75,000 households within the metro area below the poverty line. This is a 30-year plan or 30-year bond that's going to help 4,000. So we're helping 4,000 households. We're creating 4,000 units but yet we have 75,000 people, 75,000 households below the poverty line. So it really is a lottery, and I think that's the problem that the yes side faces, and housing advocates generally, is that housing assistance in the United States and in Oregon and in Portland is a lottery. And I think there's an equity issue involved. So when we talk about moral claims, I think we need to think about the morality of helping a few and not helping the many.
Okay. For Chair Dyke, if vouchers are more efficient, should counties create and fund a local voucher program?
Again, if it did no harm, then the answer would be yes, because we have a need and we need to deal with it. We have a limited number of HUD vouchers we can get from the federal government. That's and those vouchers are already allocated, so they can't be counted toward the future apartment units that we're going to be using. Should the county itself do that? Well, that's a choice for our community to look at and see what is the greatest need within our community. Is it to get more deeply into housing, or is it to provide more basic services like public safety and transportation, clean water, all the other things that come with it? It's always a trade-off, and yes, we would need to assess that.
Can I just wanted to share that there is currently a pilot where there is locally funded voucher program, and it is an option, but it again is one part of the option. When we're doing that, we're paying $1,500+ per household for rent to a private market landlord. This investment is something where the unit stays permanently affordable, and we can then be using our other public dollars to provide other types of supports and services.
And those vouchers need a place to go. There is a lack of affordable housing in this region. There's a lack of housing in this region. So to say that the voucher system is just going to be the way forward, the market is not working right now, and we could put out many more vouchers, and there would be no place for them to use them.
Hearing two white men discuss the concept of, quote, do no harm to those burdened by this bond financially, sounds like privilege and supremacy. How can we trust your opinion as a no vote when it feels so rooted in racism?
Okay,
that
that
last
one,
sentence?
I
Could you
mean, if we're
repeat the
going to
last
play the
sentence
race
again?
card, I guess I can't win. Sorry. Wrong color skin. I'm going to pass on that one.
I have yet to get my deck of race cards.
I don't have one either, so.
I think it's all of us to kind of pull ourselves out of our, out of our personal situations. I mean, as I said, I can't change the color of my skin either, but I think we need to have sympathy for low-income people. I think that should be part of our mindset, regardless of whether we're male or female or white or non-white. And I think the problem is that these units that we're proposing to build help so few of the poor, and I think that's the problem that's missing.
Sure. So, please, Lynn, I saw you go for the mic.
I think, I think that what we're hearing today is that there's actually been no good arguments put forward not to vote for this ballot measure. And in fact, we need to move forward because do nothing is not an answer.
Okay. So, and as a point of privilege, because I have this microphone, the race card isn't a thing, and I think you should probably think about stopping saying that, because we really don't have cards to play.
No,
and
but-
I think the heart of the question was,
Sure.
there are so many people that are black and brown and Native and Asian and poor and LGBTQIA plus 25 that don't have access to housing, and I think that's what they're asking because you two aren't in that position. And so they're just asking for a little empathy from you.
Okay, it sounded as though because we are two white men, we aren't qualified to make the decision.
No,
But
I think you just don't have the similar
The
experience.
point really is this isn't about the color of your skin, it's about your income status. It's about helping people get affordable housing regardless of what your color is.
But your color makes it harder for you to get a house sometimes. So just reality, that's kind of what happens sometimes. So, all right. Is it necessary to have a bond issue connected to a constitutional amendment? Either side.
Is it necessary to have the bond issue connected? It's necessary if you want the dollars to go further. You don't have to have the bond issue first. This is one of our points, is that we should have addressed the constitutional part of it before we submitted a bond proposal. And we've got it backwards. We don't know if the constitutional amendment will change. And if it doesn't, then the effectiveness of the bond issue is only a fraction of what it would be if Measure 102 passed.
Again, this isn't about spending more time waiting for other things to get done so that things can be perfect. We need to move forward now, and we need to continue making forward movement so that we can get people into stable housing. So are they tied together? Yes, so that we can be much more efficient and get more housing units out. Should we stop and wait for a constitutional amendment? Heck no.
Great. For the no side, homeowners enjoy one of the biggest tax breaks in our country through mortgage deduction. How is the 90% harmed by this bond measure in this context?
The 90% are predominantly people who are renters, not homeowners. Although there are homeowners on fixed income as well. And if they're on fixed income, if they're an elderly person, handicapped, a veteran, on fixed income, they're harmed directly by increased taxes when their income does not go up. If they are renters, if they fall within that low income category, they will see upward pressure on their rents. Now, there is a cushion in there because the market can only bear so much, but there's certainly an upward pressure to increase those rents because we know that landlords aren't going to charge less than what their inputs are, what their costs are.
Please.
So I think mortgage interest deduction is a great example of another policy that needs to be addressed as a part of addressing our housing crisis. It is the biggest subsidy that we have around housing, and the idea that that's good for homeowners, but renters don't deserve the same type of investment from our government and our elected leaders, I think is absolutely false. So I would really like to see that be a part of the policy that's addressed, as opposed to making it this is why you should vote yes or no for this. That is one of the other tools that we need to look at and address.
Great. What teeth / accountability is there to assure low-income housing is actually built? And the yes side can start.
Well, first of all, the ballot measure language says permanently affordable housing. So that is the intent, and that is the legal portion of this as we move forward. So we will need to make sure that each county housing authority has the appropriate tools for tracking and making sure that what has been invested in at the regional level with that money is never put on the market and sold. Right? That's going to have to come down to not just the region, metro, and oversight over the next 20, 30 years, but that comes right back down to the county housing authorities, who are the ones who are going to be putting out these programs.
I guess I would, at this point, I would just have to agree with Lynn. She said it correctly. So in the interest of time, I'll pass.
Okay. It's clear that employers need their employees to grow their bottom line. Can you share more about the impact of the measure on jobs and the economy? We'll start with no side.
Well, it's going to increase taxes across the region, whether it be residences or whether it be on businesses. Businesses pay personal property tax on their equipment. They're going to pay a substantial amount. But I don't know that it's significant. In all honesty, it's probably not significant to them. And I don't think it's going to impact their workforce. Unfortunately, we're talking about such a small percentage of the need being addressed that I don't think you're going to see significant increase in the workforce that will be able to utilize the affordable units.
We are in a labor shortage. There are not enough people, skilled laborers, who can afford to live in this region, and we need to attract them because we are in a labor shortage, which is driving up costs of construction all around this region. It's impacting me personally as I try to build out my accessory dwelling unit and putting my parents in my home as we move out, and it's delaying that because there's a labor shortage. It is across all spectrums of this region's economy that there are not enough skilled workers. To not have enough housing and attract them into our region, again, puts us at a disadvantage.
This measure creates new affordable housing and bureaucracy for Metro, something Metro has no experience in. Are you confident Metro can pull this off on time and on budget? Yes side.
Yes. There's more to the answer. But yes, the point here is that Metro has already been working in this arena for quite some time. For at least the last 25 years, we've had a transit-oriented development program where we've used federal money to help get affordable housing units, as many as we can, close to transit and make them accessible and affordable. We've already been in this field working with developers and nonprofits for the last 25 years. Do they want to be a housing authority, though? No. They want to be in partnership with the local jurisdictions, the local county housing authorities, and that's where the expertise is to getting these types of housing units down and getting them done cost effectively. So, yes.
I would say no. Metro has, as Lynn pointed out, been partners in affordable housing units by giving grants. They don't have the expertise to provide those units. Local governments do. And in addition, with this bond measure, there is the expectation that there's going to be a lot of strings attached for the money to flow back to local governments. After the measure passes, Metro will enter into intergovernmental agreements with local governments. We don't know yet what those intergovernmental agreements are going to say, and we don't know what strings are going to be attached or how efficient we will be with the dollars because of the strings that are on there. These are all things that should have been worked out a long time ago before this measure was even proposed.
Okay, last question for both sides. To what extent does the bond measure give new money above current government resources? To what extent would it come out of existing resources? We can start with no. Or yes. You guys can do the rock, paper, scissors again if you want.
I'm trying to understand the question. there is new money because it's a new bond measure, although it's somebody's money. Keep that in mind. It's coming from somebody. Money doesn't grow on trees. But what it also does, as I stated before, is once these units are built, then there's the expectation that local governments will put in even more money to actually subsidize and buy down the rents. And that's the part of it that we haven't taken into account in this whole bond measure process.
Yeah, I mean, again, it is new money. I think it is another of the tools that we're trying to implement in our communities to actually develop and maintain affordable housing.
And with that, we are out of time for the day and need to pause the conversation for now. Please join me in thanking our panelists and Carrie Collingmore for her moderation. And thank you to Steph Routh and Sky Waters for producing today's program. Thank you all for coming. We hope to see you again.